Hey, my name is Dr. Dante. I am Vice President of Conservation and Research here at San Antonio Zoo. We're here today to talk about one of the very, very special salamanders that we work with. This lab that you see here, this is a specialized lab where we care for subterranean species. Now, in my academic background and one of my team members, Dr. Andy, his academic background, both of us have worked with and continue to work with subterranean wildlife. So it came naturally that here at San Antonio Zoo's Center for Conservation and Research, we would spend even more time working with subterranean wildlife. And one of the projects I'm going to talk to you about today is maybe 10 or 11 years old. And we were the first zoo or facility anywhere in the country to breed in captivity the Georgia blind salamander. Now, the Georgia blind salamander is a little lightly pigmented animal with vestigial eyes or remnants of eyes or no eyes, depending on the individual. They're small. They're really cool little obligate subterranean animals, so you don't find them anywhere else. You only find them in subterranean waters. And I think that that's something that's pretty important to discuss real quick, because right here in Texas, in the Edwards Aquifer, we have our own obligate blind salamanders. This is a different aquifer. This is an aquifer below the states of Georgia and Florida and Alabama. And just like our aquifer, it has its own aquifer fauna that includes the Georgia blind salamander. So one of the things that makes this species sort of threatened or imperiled is the fact that groundwater is in such high demand, right? There's a lot of surface activity. There's a lot of people doing things like agriculture and industry, and then use for human homes, and they all need water, right? Just like we need water here in Texas. And groundwater is one of the most readily available sources for that. So there's a huge demand for groundwater, and if you kind of think about aquifer levels and you think about that demand can draw down the aquifer or bring the aquifer levels down. And the problem there is that if you do that and you start draining or lowering that aquifer level, you're actually removing habitat for the animals that live there. They are confined to groundwater. There's nowhere else to go if that water draws down to the bottom. There's no more habitat. There's no safe refuge for these things to go. So over-harvest of groundwater is one of the big issues with these salamanders. Then another issue is if you contaminate it, right? So if you are an obligate subterranean animal and you live in groundwater, but the groundwater becomes contaminated, there's nowhere else for you to go. There's no place to escape. So you are impacted by these contaminants, and contaminants can include a lot of different things. If you spray your yard with insecticide and then it rains and that runoff gets down into the groundwater, which it does, it'll bring those contaminants with it. You can have industrial spills, industrial contaminants that are not disposed of in the proper way. And then agriculture is a big one. We put all these pesticides onto our crops, and then it rains and that runoff gets down into the groundwater. Well, those things, those contaminants, they don't always break down that fast, and they can get down into the groundwater and they can cause real problems for the animals living there. So we want to pay attention when we're talking about the conservation of groundwater wildlife. We really want to pay attention to the level of the aquifer and the contamination of the aquifer. Those are two real strong forces that can push groundwater wildlife towards extinction or reduce their population base. We got involved well over 10 years ago with Georgia blind salamanders because they're one of those species that everybody's worried about. They're worried because that aquifer, the Floridan aquifer, is listed as an at-risk aquifer by the United States Geological Survey. And that means that the threats that we've already discussed, taking too much water out and contaminating it, are real significant issues, and that projecting out into the future, those issues might impact the species that live there. So we decided one of the things that we wanted to do was collaborate with Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission and Georgia Department of Natural Resources and see if we couldn't set up a colony here in a lab and figure out best practices for husbandry, and then see if we couldn't breed them in captivity. And if we were able to do both, we wanted to make sure that we got those methods published so that if all of a sudden there was some further significant decline in this groundwater salamander, labs could be set up and emergency actions could be taken, and you wouldn't be starting from scratch. In other words, you'd kind of have a playbook to pull out and follow that would tell you how to keep them and how to breed them, and you wouldn't be figuring that out with the last few salamanders. So you might ask, if these things live down in groundwater, how did you collect them? Well, fortunately, we work with an amazing team of cave divers, and the cave divers spent a lot of time going down into flooded systems down in the Floridan aquifer. You got to remember that sea level was a lot lower in past times, and caves formed, and now that sea level is higher, the groundwater levels also came up, and they flooded those caves. Well, it turns out that those caves are places where you can come into contact in the wild with things like the Georgia blind salamander, or another species down there, the Doherty plain cave crayfish. That's another one that we work with. So we work with these cave divers. They're amazing, skilled people, very dedicated to conservation. And once we have permits in hand, they will dive into these flooded systems, which is incredibly dangerous, and they will collect these animals for us, bring them to the surface, and then we can bring them back to the lab and we can work with them in the lab. So we've had a colony here in our labs here at the Center for Conservation and Research for the entire time that I've been here. And we finally figured out how to breed them in captivity last year. Again, we were the first to breed these things in captivity. And I really want to point out, and this is a really important point to make, I am so fortunate to have the team that I do. I spend a lot of time out of the country. I'm not here a lot. My team should get all of the credit for any of the successes that we have in our lab, because they did this. I didn't do this. I just made the decisions on who we would hire. These folks are really, really skilled and competent and capable. They took this plan and they enacted it, and they made sure that we got these salamanders adjusted in captivity and feeding and healthy and doing well. And then we manipulated the circumstances such that we could get eggs and then hatch those eggs out and get babies in captivity. All of that requires an incredibly skilled team, and I am so fortunate to have the team that I do here at San Antonio Zoo's Center for Conservation and Research. I just wanted to make a point that if you don't have a good team like that, you won't get anywhere with a lab like this. So our team is specialized and skilled in taking care of subterranean wildlife. We've got 5 different labs here within our facility complex where we work specifically with subterranean animals. I'm lucky in that I have Dr. Andy here with me. He's also a subterranean biologist, and we can kind of bounce ideas off one another. Andy's real smart. He's a lot smarter than I am, so it's great to have somebody like that on your staff. And again, my team was able to enact this entire plan and get this to work. So when we finally got a good set of eggs from Georgia blind salamanders, we were all so happy. I'm sure there were very ugly happy dances unfolding all over the place. And we watched those eggs, and because the lab temperature here matches the groundwater temperature of the Floridan aquifer, and that's a little bit cooler, it took the eggs quite a while to develop, and it was weeks before they actually hatched out. Now we've got healthy baby Georgia blind salamanders, and we've been able to make sure that they would eat the foods that we would offer them. They're doing great. They're growing, albeit slow. And it's really interesting now because we've also bred Texas blind salamanders in captivity, and we've done that recently in one of our other labs. So we kind of have this side-by-side comparison going on. How many eggs did this species lay? How many eggs did this one lay? How long did it take both species' eggs to hatch? When they hatched, what were the sizes? What were the differences? What kind of food preferences do each of these different species have as adults and as babies? All of those things are really interesting, and those are things that we like to get at here in our facilities so that when we ultimately write our publications on this, we can put the best possible information into the hands of the wildlife authorities in these states so that if they ever have to take emergency conservation measures, they can go ahead and do that. So that's the kind of short and skinny of why we do what we do here. What I'd like to do now, though, is show you some of these animals. They're small. An adult Georgia blind salamander is only about that big, and then the babies are less than an inch in total size right now. But I'm going to open one of the containers and try to show you an adult Georgia blind salamander. There you go. You're looking at an adult. You can see they really don't have much in the way of skin pigment. Some of them have vestigial eyes or the remnants of eyes. Some of them do not. But none of their visual structures remain intact. In other words, they can't see images like we do. We know that these salamanders can tell the difference between light and dark. So if you turn on the lights, they know you did it. But they can't see an image like humans can. And if you think about it, that makes sense. If you spend all of your life below ground in a permanently dark environment, it wouldn't make a lot of sense to invest the energy into the development of eyes and then the upkeep cost energetically of maintaining eyes and visual structures. So that all makes sense. One of the hypotheses in subterranean biology and ecology is that we see all of these species that tend to share a set of conditions that are called troglomorphisms, or characteristics that sort of suit life in the dark. That tends to be the loss of pigment. It tends to be the loss of visual structures. Sometimes if the animal has arms and hands and fingers, it's the attenuation or the elongation of the arms and the fingers, the thinning of those structures. In salamanders, groundwater salamanders tend to have a few more teeth than the species that they're related to on the surface. The hypothesis behind that is that if you only get to eat a few times a year, you better take advantage of the opportunities that you have, and you better be a pretty efficient predator with those scarce opportunities that come down the path. So that's sort of the suite of characteristics that you can see. And the cool thing is you see that in salamanders, you see that in invertebrates like crayfish and amphipods and isopods. You also see it in other vertebrates. You see it in cavefish. Cavefish tend to also have a reduction or a loss in pigmentation and in visual structures. Those are all things that are pretty common between a whole suite of unrelated subterranean organisms. So that's one thing that this salamander shares in common with the one that we have below us here in San Antonio, the Texas blind salamander, which this species is related to. Now what I'm going to do is try to show you a baby Georgia blind salamander in one of the tanks we have here in the lab. If you look, sitting on top of this sponge filter, there's a little tiny white, it almost looks like a thread, and that is a baby Georgia blind salamander that's easily less than an inch in total length. And that's one of the group of babies that we have here at San Antonio Zoo from the last captive breeding success that we had. And we're raising them here in this lab specially designed to do just that. So you're looking at baby Georgia blind salamanders.
Michelle asked if they need to be temperature controlled to care for them.
Okay, Michelle, that's a great question. Do they have to be temperature controlled? Absolutely, they do. These labs have been engineered and designed such that we can get the temperature within a half a degree of where we need it to be. The walls are super insulated, and the systems are all doubly redundant. In other words, because we're in Texas and because we have really hot summers, I didn't want to rely on any one environmental system to accommodate imperiled or critically endangered animals. So all of the systems on this building are doubly redundant in that we've got two systems that run the entire building and could keep this lab at a good cool temperature if they had to. But then this lab has its own system that's not connected to any other lab. So we had to think about those kinds of things in advance just in case we had some sort of an issue. And also, one of the other steps we had to take, just in case the power went out, we didn't want to have a brownout or a blackout and lose animals to the heat. So this building has its own backup generator with enough petrol to go days on its own if the electrical grid went down. So We tried to think of all those things in advance when we were designing these labs, and it was an expensive process, but if you're going to bring imperiled and endangered animals into captive circumstances, you really need to take ownership of that and take the preventative steps and measures to make sure that nothing bad could happen that you could have prevented.
Gina would like to know what the purpose of the blind salamander is.
That's a great question. So, one of the things that we really need to think about with all of the animals on the planet is that every species is a web or a piece of a web, and think of like a giant spider web, and think of all the different strands, and think of those species as representing strands in a web. All of them are interconnected and they all interact in a very specific way. So imagine this, if you had a beautiful spider web that was sitting out in a doorway, and it was all lit up so that you could see it, and then you had a pair of scissors and you started cutting strands out, you really wouldn't have to go too many strands in before you would lose the structural integrity of that web, and the entire thing would collapse. And food webs are exactly the same. If you start cutting out too many threads in that web, you'll face imminent collapse of the entire web. And each of those strands is really important. And so this subterranean food web or ecosystem, these blind salamanders, they play critical roles in those food webs. Now there's another aspect to that you really should think about, and that is, how can organisms living in groundwater benefit human beings? And I don't ever like to boil biodiversity down to what humans can get out of it, but I think it's a fair question, and I get that one regularly. So consider this. Groundwater organisms live down in the groundwater, exactly like the name implies, and they are acutely aware of contaminants that may flush through that body of water, and they don't have anywhere else to go. So the way that we typically test groundwater for health and safety measures are spot checks. That means that we'll take a sample of water from somewhere and we'll look to see if it's contaminated. The problem with that system is that it only tells you exactly what the water was like at that specific point in time and place. It doesn't tell you across the long term what may have flushed through, a contaminant may have passed through and we missed it with the spot check. But the animals living in the groundwater, they didn't miss it because they were exposed to it and there was no one else or nowhere else to go. We need to pay attention to the health of the community of groundwater organisms living in these groundwater bodies that we rely so heavily upon, because they're a great indicator of the quality of the groundwater. And because we eat and cook and drink with this groundwater, and we bathe with it, and we use it around the house, groundwater quality is really important to humans, just like it's important to the animals that live down there. And I'm not arguing that we should get rid of spot checks of groundwater, but what I am saying is that we should absolutely keep close tabs on the health of the animals living down in the groundwater. It'll tell us a lot about the quality of a resource that our lives are dependent on, just like the lives of the animals living there.
Michelle would like to know what their diet consists of.
Michelle, that's a great question. So right now with these baby Georgia blind salamanders, we do several things. For starters, we hatch out a little type of shrimp that are called brine shrimp. And one really interesting thing about brine shrimp is that they're filter feeders. In other words, they pull things out of the water. They strain things from the water when they feed. So when we hatch those babies out, we can actually put a dusting of amphibian vitamins in there, and we can put a dusting of highly nutritious foods that have been ground down into a powder. Those brine shrimp filter feed that out, and then we can feed the brine shrimp to the baby salamanders, and they get an even healthier meal out of it. So that's one of the things we do. But to make sure that we vary the diet with these salamanders, we mix in a host of frozen foods so that we present the animal with a balanced diet in captivity, and we make sure that they're getting all of the nutrients that they need as they develop and grow up. But because this hasn't been done before, we're learning a lot. Every time we take a step, it's sort of a step that hadn't been taken previously. Unfortunately, when you start to work with species like this in captivity, there's not a how-to manual. That's our job, to write those how-to manuals. but we don't have one. So a lot of times these processes can be messy and they can be difficult and they can be complicated, but we make sure to take careful notes, and we have a lot of meetings about what we're doing, and we actively discuss both successes and failures that we've had, so that the next time we're presented with an opportunity, we can make a better go of it.
Is there a way to tell the difference between males and females just by looking at them?
That's a really good question. So as far as we know, Georgia blind salamanders, just like Texas blind salamanders, are not sexually dimorphic. In other words, you couldn't just look at them and say, oh, that's a male or that's a female. We think we might see slight differences. Females, in some cases, tend to get a little bit bigger, and they tend to be a little bit heavier bodied. And the reasons for that are really biologically oriented. For example, because females have to hold eggs in their bodies, they tend to have the space to hold those eggs, and they tend to be a little bit bigger. In species where you tend to see males get a little bit bigger, you tend to see things like male-male combat in those species. So there tends to be a biological reason for why one sex would be larger than the other in animals. But in cave salamanders, if there's a difference at all, it's very slight, and I think females might be slightly bigger than males, but it's a very slight difference. That is a great question, and I will be able to answer that question a little bit better for you here in the next year or two. We really don't know yet. We don't know the age at which a Georgia blind salamander hits sexual maturity, but because we're working with this group that's growing up, as soon as they show signs of sexual maturity, we'll be able to answer that question a little bit better. My guess is going to be somewhere between 1.5 and 2 years of age. But that's just an educated guess.
And would you mind showing us again the size of an adult?
Sure, no problem. Let me lift the lid to one of these containers. We have adult salamanders down in this. Now, you might think it's funny that we're keeping them in these plastic boxes, but we've got reasons for it. These are food-safe plastic boxes. In other words, the plastic won't deliver any chemicals into the water. So they're safe that way, but we like to make sure that we can see the animals daily. We want to make sure that we check on their weight and their body condition when we're feeding them. We want to be able to make sure that we know who's eating and who isn't. It's really important in these circumstances that we keep tabs on the health and condition of all of the individuals in our care. So we have kind of funny looking circumstances here, but those circumstances lend well to our ability to care better for the animals that are here. I can look in one of these other boxes and see if there's anybody. There's one up right close on the inside of the lip. This is another adult Georgia blind salamander. You might notice too, they don't have the exact same skin color as the Texas blind salamanders. The Texas blind salamanders have almost a silvery blue color overall to their skin. These Georgia blind salamanders are decidedly pink or orange in color. So there's no trouble mixing up or no potential risk of mixing up the two species. They really do look different. You might also notice that they have a shovel-shaped head. That's another structure that one hypothesis is that those structures, the flattening of the head, lends well to prey capture. So again, if you're a little blind salamander and you're living down in an aquifer and there really aren't that many opportunities to catch a meal, you don't want to miss the few opportunities that you do have. And if you come across something like a little invertebrate, like an amphipod or an isopod, you want to make sure that you capture them efficiently. And these salamanders, with their big shovel-shaped heads, they can fit more teeth into their mouths, and they're a little bit more efficient at prey capture than the salamanders that they're related to on the surface. There we go. This is another container with another group of adult salamanders.
I know breeding this species has been a really great success for the conservation team. Can you tell us about any other big successes that you all have had?
Well, so again, I'd love to have the opportunity to brag about my team. We just in the past few weeks have been able to breed another critically endangered salamander for the very first time ever in captivity. And interestingly, it is kind of a subterranean salamander. It's called the reticulated flatwood salamander, and the last really healthy breeding population is in the middle of Eglin Air Force Base of all places. And the Air Force has been an incredible steward of the land. They've taken such good care of the land, in fact, that there's still this healthy population of this critically endangered salamander out on the land. And they spend most of their lives, like 98% of their lives, below ground. They follow down little systems that go below tree roots and animal burrows and such, and they live below ground. And so we really don't know what they do with 98% of their lives. But once a year, they come up in the midwinter or early spring, and they crawl along the ground at night on really humid nights, and they look for depressions in the ground. And those depressions will turn into ponds once the rains show up, and they lay their eggs at the bottom of those dry depressions, and then they go right back underground. And then when the seasonal rains come, they flood those depressions, those turn into ponds, and the eggs hatch, and they go through a very abbreviated or short larval period where they have gills and a tail fin, just like the salamanders you're looking at now. But that doesn't last more than a few weeks, and then they change into terrestrial salamanders. Those gills go away, and the tail fin goes away, and then those salamanders go right back underground, just like their parents had been living underground. And so they're a very mysterious salamander. We were lucky enough to be able to breed those in captivity again for the first time ever. And you know, again, all credit to my team. They've been working with this salamander for years. That's another 10 or so year project. And we just got our first group of good eggs here this year. And as a matter of fact, they've all hatched. We've got over 75 healthy baby aquatic salamanders in a different lab. They're isolated from everything else, just like these animals are isolated from everything else. And they're growing. They're eating a ton. They're looking great. We're really excited about this. And the reason we're so excited about this is that because we're down to one really healthy population, if we want to intervene and we want to prevent this species from slipping into extinction, we're going to have to learn a little bit about the introduction of captive bred salamanders to areas in the wild that no longer have salamanders but are within the traditional range of this species. So we're working with U.S. Fish and Wildlife and other wildlife agencies like Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission and Georgia DNR, and we'll find a protected piece of land, and we'll make sure that all the conditions there are appropriate for these salamanders, and we'll breed them in captivity here, and then bring out larval salamanders and put them in the ponds out on that land. We're going to want to make sure that those ponds have enough water so that the salamanders can go all the way through their larval developmental period. So we may artificially set up a situation where we can add water to the pond to make sure it doesn't dry out too quickly. But the goal will be putting animals back onto the landscape in collaboration with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and state wildlife agencies. And then we also work with Virginia Tech, biologists there that have also been working with these salamanders for a very long time. And we value our partnerships with these places very, very much. And all of them will be involved in this effort to reintroduce a population to the landscape. And we're hopeful that that process might unfold here in the next year or two. So it was a very, very exciting step. It was a huge hurdle to get past. Now we know we can breed these things in captivity. We know we can rear the eggs and hatch the eggs. We already knew that we could hatch eggs and rear larvae in captivity because we've been doing that for a few years. And it's just really nice to know that you can get a group of animals up to an adult condition and then manipulate those conditions such that you can get them to breed in captivity. And again, all credit to my team. I'm so proud of them for all the things that they've been able to accomplish. I think one other thing that's really important to mention with all of these projects, we have incredible partnerships. For example, with the Texas Blind Salamander project, we work with the Edwards Aquifer Authority, and they've been amazing partners for years now on that project. So we just bred that species for the second time ever in our labs. And we've got another beautiful, healthy, developing set of eggs in the lab. Those eggs are there, and those circumstances arose because of that partnership. The Edwards Aquifer Authority really invested a lot of time and effort and energy and money with us in developing these labs so that we could have these successes. And I think it's so important for us to mention all of our great partners around nationally and internationally on all of our projects, because without those partnerships, we really couldn't have these achievements that we're talking about here today.
Can you tell us how many eggs they lay?
Yeah, so we have, with these guys, we're looking at clutch sizes that range anywhere from a dozen to maybe 2 dozen. We have reason to believe that clutch sizes might be able to get all the way up towards 25 or 30 eggs in a really big female who's been fed a lot in advance. Again, you've got to remember the biology and ecology of these animals really ties into how many eggs they produce, because down in a subterranean environment, there isn't primary productivity. And let me explain what I mean by that. There's no photosynthesis in these environments. In other words, there's no plants enacting photosynthesis and serving as the primary base of the food web, because there's no light in subterranean food webs. So that the next logical question you might ask is, okay, well, how does energy get into these subterranean systems at all? And there are several pathways. For one, it's called allochthonous energy, or energy sources that come from somewhere else. So think about this: a big colony of bats that lives in a certain kind of cave at night. They fly around the landscape and they eat all these bugs, or they eat fruit, whatever kind of bat it is. And then they go back to the caves and they deposit guano. Well, that guano is an energy source, and it turns out that there are entire communities of organisms that focus on those energy sources to break them down and feed on them. And so in that instance, the primary food source in a subterranean environment is decomposition based. It's not plant based. So as the guano breaks down and as things feed on that energy source, the guano, they're really starting at a decomposition level. Well, when you do that, when you have a decomposition-based food web, it has a whole lot less energy flowing through it. And when you have less energy flowing through a food web or an ecosystem, you're going to have fewer individuals. So across the board, subterranean animals tend to have fewer offspring, and there tend to be fewer individuals of those species than if you were comparing them to a surface animal that they're related to. I'll give you a quick example. In a surface crayfish, you might have a female that produces anywhere from 100 to 300 eggs. In a subterranean crayfish, she might have a dozen eggs. In a surface salamander, you might have an animal that lays 100 eggs. In a groundwater salamander like this, they might lay a dozen or 20 eggs. So you really can see those differences, and those differences come from the circumstances that led to the evolution of these animals, that led to the adaptations that they had, that led to the circumstances where they just don't have a lot of energy to start with, so it doesn't make sense to produce a whole bunch of babies because there wouldn't be the energy sources there to feed them all. So all of those things are really tied in.
Can you tell our viewers that are watching right now what they can do at home to help save animals like the blind salamander, help out our zoo, and continue to contribute towards conservation?
So you've just learned about one of many conservation projects that we have going here at San Antonio Zoo's Center for Conservation and Research. When we weren't all hunkered down under the COVID-19 event that's unfolding right now, what would have been taking place is that we've got guests visiting the zoo every day, and as they pass through the gates and they pay admission, those ticket sales really fund everything that we do. And that includes the activities up here at Center for Conservation and Research. And we don't have that right now. We don't have people coming through the gates. As you well know, the gates are closed. So what I would ask all of you, please help us right now. If you go to the main webpage for the zoo, www.sazoo.org. There's a landing page there where you can donate to the zoo, and you can help us through this time. If you like the conservation initiatives you've just heard about, or any of the others that you're going to hear about over the next few days, or you might have heard about in the past few days, all of those things are funded by the public, by ticket sales and by concession sales here at the zoo. We're not a city-funded zoo. You might not know that. We're a 501c3, and we're not city, county, or state-funded. So we really rely on the revenue generated by ticket sales and concession sales to make all of this work. So my personal request to you would be that you go to our website, and it doesn't matter how much it is. Help us out right now. We really need that, particularly if you believe in the conservation work that we're doing. That would be a great way to help us right now. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time, and we'll take you through more labs here with more Facebook Live sessions here at San Antonio Zoo's Center for Conservation Research. Thank you.